Oh, hang on. I need to share screen. One sec. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you to the IRB for having me as an artist-in-residence, and also for offering to hold this seminar. The project I applied to be artist-in-residence at the IRB was called Contingent Contagion. The application was made before we'd even heard of the word COVID or the pandemic that we're now living in, and was ideally looking at the idea of what happens when artists and scientists work along together, how methodologies can interlink, and therefore the idea of contingent being side by side, how the contagion can pass, how ideas can pass from one to the other. It had no relationship to COVID, although obviously COVID has ultimately had a contagious effect on the whole residency. The talk I'm giving this morning is called Contingent Contagion and Visualizing the Invisible, as it talked briefly about what I had hoped to do, or what I hope still to do at the IRB, and also the idea of visualizing the invisible that informs my practice as an artist and as a researcher. One of the my interest within the idea of how artists and scientists can work together is how different forms of knowledge can be interlinked. I'm interested in the idea of how, as an artist, obviously my scientific background is limited. I'm drawn to it as a territory or a kind of landscape of thought and intellectual endeavor that I can appear only as a kind of side tangential viewer. So I'm a bit like this anamorphic skull within the painting The Ambassadors by Holbein. The different systems of symbols, the idea of the different forms of presentation, the figurative, the clarity of the images presented by Holbein of the two figures and all the symbols that approach, that are attached to them, the idea of knowledge, counters with the vision of the skull, the sense of, in this painting, the sense of death, but the idea of how to be able to see the skull, you need to be able to lose sight of the figures or the portraited of the elements. So the idea of how within a painting you can have two visions. My idea of the residency is having different visions of what goes on within the Institute of Research. The sense that my knowledge is, or my vision is not about trying to reproduce or represent the science, so much as to give a different vision or a different interpretation to try and stimulate debate and to try and create a different way of looking at the science and the research that has been undertaken. So it's a kind of tangential view. Holbein, they say, painted this painting possibly for a staircase, so that the idea that when you went up the staircase, you would see the skull. But it's the idea of how there's two different viewpoints, showing a different way, a different perspective, a different consideration of the same idea. Within my process of making art, thinking through doing and thinking through overlaying of different systems of representation forms an intrinsic part. One of the points of departure for this is the work of Aby Warburg. Aby Warburg created what was called the Nemnus Atlas. It was a picture series for examining the function of preconditioned antiquity-related massive values for the presentation of eventful life in the art of the European Renaissance. He created these movable boards where he laid out different systems of images, references, documentation, tracing the contagion of one element through other periods of time. So the idea is you have different images dating from classical antiquity and how the figures, the poses, the gestures are reiterated through different systems of representation or as artworks and different continents. Within these boards, he never fixed them. They were never a process, partly because he died before they were finished, but the archive was always movable. It was always a piece in process. And so the idea of how this atlas, this kind of configuration of different elements that interrelate, that that create contagion of ideas, and the idea of traveling concepts. So the idea of how something can move from one to the other. Mika Ball talks about the idea of traveling concepts, of how you can have a hybrid that starts off as a terminology used in biology and now is used within our practices, such as Eduardo Katz, that I will talk about later, but also about the idea of collaging processes, joining things together. So one of the references within this process of research is the idea of how you can have contagion through the reconfiguration of references, the creating of dialogues between different forms of presentation. Within my research, looking at the way different invisible structures are presented, the idea of how you can present something that is not visible to the naked eye, I was driven by the ideas explored by Daston and Gallison in Objectivity, a book that explores the methods used by scientists to visualize micro and macro structures. They talk about three different types: the idea of truth to nature, where different visions are used to create a kind of morphological mean or average of a visual form, but also of natural diagrams and numerical diagrams, and the idea of mechanical objectivity, and the idea of trained judgment, the vision they say is now used today, where basically different forms of information are processed and intuition and knowledge used to hone and create a different form of vision. I would say that trained judgment forms part of all of these different forms of visualization. And so one of the ways I work is to endeavor to create different kind of dialogues between, in this case, a board of different forms of drawing, sculptures and diagrams and maps that interrelate the idea of different protein structures, linking past and present, linking different systems of making, but very much through making hands-on, how different kinds of processes can interrelate. Equally, the idea of natural diagrams, about how diagrams can be drawn by the forces of nature. In this case, there are a series of different drawings relating to handmade processes of the spiritualists or the Chladni figures, where sounds are transmitted into diagrams or natural forms drawn by the forces of nature, which would link into what Daston and Gallison talk about with the idea of mechanical objectivity. But I was interested in this and how also the spiritualists become involved, the sense of how spiritualist visionaries like Georgina Horton or Josepha Tolra become this idea of almost a kind of machine to transmit the voices of spiritual guides who transcribe their ideas and words into drawings. A third set of references would be the idea of numerical diagramming, how the idea of different systems of tracking can be information reduced to a simple line, to a straightforward graphical, la méthode graphique, as Etienne Marais would say. This idea of tracing complexity into a simple form of line. But one of the ideas that became the reason for my thesis was the construction of a methodological analysis. My first introduction to the IRB was the process d'Ompoac. D'Ompoac was the idea of trying to work with two scientists at the IRB, Jordi Duran and Isabel Saif, and looking at their methodologies. It was one of my first experiences of the IRB, and sadly it seems to be one of my present experience, in the sense it was very hard to enter into the laboratories at that time because of the processes of protocol, and at this present point because of COVID. But it was looking about how the scientists worked, and ultimately the piece that was developed in collaboration with Alicia Vela, Elod Buch, and Marta San Gregorio tried to transpose what was their methodology, the idea of identifying the object of investigation, capturing of data, the synthesizing of the data, and the outputting of their research into visual outcome became transcribed into a series of collaborative processes that took information and reiterated it through different processes of interruption and manipulation, resulting ultimately in the presentation of an installation that looked like a series of microscopic slides, where each of the images were produced and related to the different processes of manipulation that tried to reinterpret the process and methodology identified by Jordi Duran and Isabel Saif. The process, although frustrating at the time, ultimately became a process that allowed me to look at the way systems of methodologies could divide my PhD, but also the way I look at different forms of processing information to try and visualize what can be seen. It led to the book, How to Draw and Visualize the Invisible, a primer with no step-by-step directions. A book that's designed as a sketchbook, but also as a point of departure. In the book, I itemized all the different diagrams or systems of visualization that I had explored during my PhD thesis. It was a visual thesis as opposed to the written thesis that formed the obligatory part of my PhD presentation. It became almost a journey, a logbook of the different ways of how you can transcribe ideas. The natural diagrams, in this case, interrelating drawings of Jackson Pollock with the particle contrails from bubble chamber photographs. It endeavored to avoid the problems of copyright, but also to explore the way different systems can talk across, how concepts can travel, as Mika Bauer would say. I was interested in this consideration of the different invisible structures that I explored, about how the diagrams could be transposed into ways of making art. On the left, there was a series of processes looking at the spatiotemporal patterns evolved in the simple drying process or expansion of ink through water. And on the right, looking at the strange tapeworms and plaster models used to exemplify forms of cellular growth. I've had some of the models from the late 19th century created a sense of strangeness that differed from many of the more digital and familiar or high technicolored images produced by scientific visualization today. Within the process, I was interested in how different forms of contagion appear within ideas of making. So you have the sense of, in these, the images of Margaret Watt Hughes, the sound or voice figures made using an idophone, where she blew into the structure and a small tympanum creates these series of different drawings that explored her experimentation with voice as a way of trying to create images from the resonance of her voice. The idophone echoes the drawings of the images, of the drawings of the forces of resonance done by Chladni in dust, but here transposed into tree forms or daisy forms. It was the idea of a visual artist and an operatic singer and quasi-scientist using a system of scientific endeavor to try and create a series of images. A different form of contagion can be seen in Max Ernst's Gamenous bicycle garnished with bells. Here, an image of cell mitosis, a school board lithograph designed to display the different series of cell development, has been transcribed, reworked, and manipulated to create a different image, where the surreal references to different forms of interaction, to sexual connotations, create a different dialogue. I'm perhaps closer to Ernst than I am to Watt Hughes, but I'm interested in how the ideas of these different forms of contagion can create new dialogues, new forms of knowledge. One of the things that interests me within scientific visualization, however, is the use or systems of visualization that are very akin to Baroque or traditional forms of still life, albeit that scientists are looking at images that are beyond the scope of natural light as we know it, be it through the microscope or in the image of quantum coral by Eigler, Lutz, and Cromie, where you're looking at systems of probability, is how the sense of modulation, of light and dark, of chiaroscuro are applied to images that lie way beyond the scale that light would function in the way that we know it. In Hook, the lines, the engraving, the structure of network of engraved lines echoes the systems used to represent portraits of the 17th century, but here applied to a vision of the fly's eye. Similarly, an image by Eigler, Lutz, and Cromie, Quantum Coral, an image traced from scan tunneling microscopes, where it is more a question of probabilities than this clear vision of structures of modulated light and dark with glowing colors, where almost a sense of tangibility is applied to something that is more probability. So I'm interested in how questions of familiarity are introduced to the idea of systems of visualization, even though it lies beyond what we can see. So within my process of making art, I'm interested in the idea of how you can have indexical visions of invisible structures, but also propositional. Indexical would be more data-based, questions of direct register, and propositional where there's more a system of metaphors, envisaged worlds, or heuristic models. I lie more on the right-hand side, but there are obviously endeavors that explore more data-constructed visions of the indexical. Within this idea of the indexical image, one could play with the questions of DNA explored by Dewey Hagberg and Chelsea Manning. And here, probably Chelsea, the image is a series of heads modulated through algorithmic programming, where DNA extracted from Chelsea Manning is transmitted into a series of poems or heads generated by algorithmic programming, elaborating DNA and possible registrations of face figures. So you have this sense of different portraits of the same person, all relating to the DNA of Dewey Hagberg, but relating to the DNA of Chelsea Manning, but retranscribed into different heads. They are all relevant to her making, or to his making, the idea of transgender identity, but each reveals a different portrait, a different form of registration. A different form idea of indexical visioning can be seen in the work of Eduardo Cac, where here the idea of biomanipulation forms part. In Natural History of the Enigma, you have the idea of Edurnia, a flower that is part animal, part human. The flower incorporates, the petunia incorporates part of the DNA of Eduardo Cac, a plantimon, a hybrid, once again, of the idea of plant and DNA manipulation. Or Eduardo Cac's bunny, Alba, where a mixture of luminescent jellyfish and rabbit creates an albino rabbit that glows in the dark. Here, the idea of direct manipulation of the biomaterial creates a different kind of approach, a more indexical approach, a more scientific approach, but one that lays up a series of different moral issues that I avoid with my more propositional approach. So in my creation of this idea of different forms of structure, I'm interested in the idea of how science visualization uses ways of world making. Nelson Goodman talks about the idea of how the arts and sciences are different ways of elaborating visions of the world. They're all artifactums, they're all made. And in this sense, I endeavor to avoid the division of the two cultures explored by C.P. Snow in his Reed lecture of the 1950s. I don't want to set up an opposition so much as to create a dialogue. And so here in Petrification, it was the idea of how a painted model could play with the idea of petri dishes as these strange little worlds where scientists explore and establish their own criteria and their own forms of world making to endeavor to unravel the problems and issues they are investigating of our actual reality. So the creation of a different world, here cast in resin to create a kind of fictional world, or what would Catherine Elgin would call a felicitous falsehood. Elgin talks about the importance of felicitous falsehoods within science as ways of using metaphor or questions such as ideal gases that are not real but allow cognitive knowledge to be exemplified, offering a way in. They may not be epistemically true, but they do allow a way of creating new forms of understanding. In this, one of the things that I'm interested in is the use of metaphors. How often scientists resort to metaphors to establish a way into a different form of appreciation of something that can't be seen. John Wheeler's vision, in answer to the question of how can one see what a black hole is, talks about how the metaphor of a ballroom, that when the lights are turned off and all you can see the girls dancing around, where the men in black would disappear. This was the 1950s after all. And how basically you know the black hole is there, the men, as the women are dancing around them, but you can't be seen. How metaphors can allow a way into understanding a form of visualization or understanding a concept that lies beyond what can be seen, but also beyond the ken of most. In my consideration of the different forms of visualization, I've been introduced in the idea of string theory. String theory is a field of speculation. It's not provable as such, but is evolved through different forms of mathematical propositions. Physicists speculate and endeavor to unravel a vision of the cosmos that explores 11 or 16 dimensions and talks of oscillating strings. Michel Kakow relates it to the idea of a multiverse and resorts to a koi carp drawn from a pond, lifted out of this watery world to endeavor to explore this idea of different layers within a multiverse. But here I resorted to a simple structure or a simple algorithm, man-made forms, playing with prototypes developed in SolidWorks, a simple brain, a simple loop, because some of the theories of string theory talk about forms resorted to brains, so closed loops, and the idea of how the cosmos becomes a form of infinitesimal strings oscillating within the different vibrations, creating the difference between you, me, and other materials. Here, the different loops create a kind of multiple structure, endeavoring to repeat, conglomerating to form a complex form. But the impression that the digital 3D print became too solid, too firm, too sure for something that seemed so uncertain. And so my process evolved to endeavor to find different ways to create what would be a more uncertain premise within this exploration of string theory. Here, I'm not representing it so much as exemplifying or responding to what I feel were a series of panoramas that lay beyond my vision, but also my ken. In The Model is Not Manifold, I therefore developed a process of an open table, a field of vision where the viewer was left to unravel or to configure their own cosmological vision or interpretation. Here, there was no direct reference to string theory, so much as the idea of how each of the different models, be they 3D plastic printed models that hang from the ceiling, or the different forms of cyanotypes traced on the light box, were left open as if there was still a vision to be made. Cosmological paradigms change, and as we changed, as Kuhn would say, that as soon as there is new accord, we would have a new vision within scientific understanding of what is the cosmos. But here the idea was an open structure, a field of open endeavor, once again, the process. Within my elaboration of these different models, intrinsic were the drawings, were the structures and models developed by Hodgkin, Perutz, and Kendrew. I'm interested in how, within the process of elaborating these models, they grew crystals through which X-ray diffraction is elaborated, through which the structures are then traced. Originally, in the times of Hodgkin, not through computers, but through what were called the computer girls, where women knitted together the structures in elaborated contour maps, realizing the different activity of the electrons around the atoms, revealing the atoms not so much through their presence, so much as their absence, the electrons, their activity indicating their presence. I was interested in how both Hodgkin and Perutz use this sense of stacking, the relationship of the different elements layered on top of each other, extracted from the different X-ray diffraction images and through the maps elaborated by the computer girls. I was interested in how the very simple kind of almost homemade materials used to elaborate these different structures. And these led, in the initial case, to a prototype that was within the model is not manifold, that is a laser cut plastic glass. Here, the original model that I had presented that seemed too solid was elaborated in its negativity, each hole within the layer producing one section of the form, creating kind of echo to Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin's image of the structure of penicillin. I was interested in, therefore, in how different processes could be elaborated to create this kind of dialogue between what is homemade or what is a very man-made structure, working beyond something very tangible to something that lies on such a microcellular level. Within my interest in these almost domestic or Luddite system exploration, I was interested in the cosmological models developed by Yusofi and Mozenzela in their visualizing cosmological concepts using the analog of a hot liquid, where they, to explore the idea of the Big Bang, they used an image of a vessel filled with milk placed on a gas burner that slowly erupts. The idea of a cosmological vision that was placed on YouTube and has since disappeared, maybe because the images didn't comply with what would be called typical scientific visualizations. But for me, it was an image that explored a sensory experience of the Big Bang. One all knows the smell of milk as it burns, and the sense of how something could be a visualization that incorporates different forms of embodied knowledge intrinsically drew me to it. Similarly, Alexander Crum Brown's models of interpenetrating surfaces sit curiously in the Whipple Museum amongst all the other more traditional methods of visualization. What I was interested in his method was how he used knitting to develop a series of models as a way of thinking, but also of showing how he would use these different structures knitted together to show these mathematical formula to himself, but to almost unravel, to reconstruct and reconfigure, to therefore present them to his students. How a kind of sort of domestic introduction within the visualization processes. This led me to develop a manifestly molded, which is a crochet knitted model in nylon cord that plays with the idea of a simple loop structure. It reiterates the idea of repetition, serialization, and algorithmic, or basic, in this case, man-made algorithmic construction, repeating a simple loop. My idea was to explore what structure would be evolved out of this kind of repetition of a very simple crocheted gesture, one loop. I was horrified, but also intrigued by the fact, much though I had criticized the use of familiar images within much scientific visualization in the late 20th century, how also a figure or a recognizable form appeared, a cloud. The structure of what my vision of this string theory had never been meant to be a familiar form, but ultimately the idea of this generated repetition of a simple stitch, playing with the idea of a domestic taking a line for a walk, evolved into a cosmological model that became a cloud of thinking, a cloud of activity. Within my process of trial and error, there is always what could be called a sense of catastrophe and carpentry. This series of images shows some of the process when I was elaborating the prototype models for 3D printing, how many of the forms in meshworks would highlight the problems within their construction, although generated using engineering computer 3D programs. The printing mechanisms highlighted the different problems and faults. I was intrigued, therefore, within these about how the accident, how the process itself could reveal a different kind of translation, a different interpretation. Although I've not made images from these actual structures, to me it was interesting to highlight this importance of this glitch, of how accident and this catastrophe can also lead to a different form of interpretation. And so within this, the 3D models that I developed ultimately became about enhancing the problems of their construction. This small 3D print is a revision or a reiteration of what was the original circular structure. Here, the original form is lost, embedded within the glitches elaborated by the 3D program. Here, the actual structure within this kind of cocoon in the inner center is the form that was elaborated by me. But in the process of printing it through different forms of printing, different structures have evolved. It becomes this strange kind of dialogue between my original version of the string theory and the reiteration of what are the structures required to actually print. To me, the similarities between an image such as John Kendrew's original model of the myoglobin molecule are intrinsic to how I approach my making. Here in Kendrew's model, it was elaborated through plasticine and different forms of wood. It's this almost repellent structure, but attractive because of its very tangible tactility. I'm interested in, therefore, how translation can create a new form, a strange form. I want to eschew some of the more technicolored delights of contemporary visualization to find something that appeals to the hands, to appeal to looking through knowing, through almost a tactile, tentacular way of thinking. In some of the more recent work, I've been toward the idea of quantum loop theory, a different kind of speculative approach to looking at the way space can be considered almost like a spin foam. The idea of space as granular, as related to different form of structures. And here the sense of contagion or contingency relates to the idea of how my exploration of Carlo Rovelli's order of time and the reality is not what it is. Looking at the ideas of quantum loop theory led me to look at different forms of loops and structures that will lay around me. My frustration with 3D printing through the limitations of the space or the scale of the works that can be produced led me to want to make larger images, to find a way where I could look at reiteration, these strange loopy structures, playing with the idea of granularity, but on a larger scale. And the idea of those simple forms that you find every day lying around beside you, the structures that hold together cans of beer became my point of departure. Those small loops, those plastic structures that have no name and that hopefully will now be fossil foundlings in the sense that one will no longer find them in the spaces around us. Those plastic structures that join together 6 or 9 or 12 beer cans or Coca-Cola cans are little forms of natural diagrams. Whenever they are used, whenever the can has been removed, they display the structure or the diagram of the force that has been used to remove them from the can. They are small indexes of what has happened to them. Here in this image, they appear on the left-hand side, 2 of these structures that have been painted in fluorescent paint so that such that when the lights go out, they glow in the dark. The idea is how they reveal the anger or the simplicity, or how some people cut, some people rip, some people simply squeeze them out. Each one is a diagram of who has opened or used these forms. There are little small granular loops of space-time referencing the people who have used them. And so I return to painting. The large figures on the right-hand side of the image, the fossil foundlings 2, 3, 4, and 5, are images, portraits of these almost ghostly references. They play with the idea of these figures, x-rays almost, of the structures that appear from these diagrams of force. But returning to now, my experience at IRB is not quite in sight, as this small artist book would suggest. I'm looking at the different processes, and I have begun to have conversations with some of the scientists working within the IRB. COVID has meant that my residency is very much from afar. And so the conversations become very much related to computer programming, to the exploration of different conversations, trying to endeavor to understand through a hands-off approach, something I find very difficult. But I would like to thank all the scientists who have been working with me or endeavoring to explore their ideas, the conversations who I've recorded and who I've re-listened to several times, but inevitably much of the content lies beyond my knowledge. And so what I've been working on in the last few months has been pieces such as Contingent, which are small drawings, mixed media on tracing paper, very much small scale tabletop work, because COVID also had me between spaces, stuck within neither a studio space nor in residency in the IRB, as almost space in between, a lindar, as they would say in Catalan, a threshold. But what I am interested in, and what has come from these, is a different form of contagion, one that I hadn't expected. And these are the covert conversations. Following the IRB thread, almost like an intruder, like a voyeur, there are strange conversations that appear. Does anyone have? Strange letters, strange words, strange structures. And so one of the projects that I'm working on are these covert conversations that have come through COVID. Nobody knows I'm there, or at least they never think somebody is actually copying and pasting all those strange, I have some, does anybody need? Does anyone have? What is this thing I have found? Does somebody have a DHL packages that has arrived? Somehow or other, my contingent contagion has led somewhere that I never thought it would. But then a process of research sometimes has to go to unknown places. And so covert conversations will ultimately become a book and an audio piece where the text will be read by bots, not by humans, so that nobody can feel as if their voice has been manipulated without their control. But the idea to try and bring how different forms of research, different forms of visualization can lead to unknown places. And so in this, I would like to thank the IRB for their experience of allowing me in different forms, and I hope in greater depth in the future if COVID permits. And I would like specifically to thank Muriel, Blazes, Clara, Joel, Marta, and all the multiple voices of the IRB email feed that weren't quite aware that I was there, but I am. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jo. Very nice talk. Okay, so anyone has any question? Do you want to unmute your mics, or you are free to do so now? Any question you have? Any comment? You can put your cameras on now. I can start if you want, Joe, until people warm up. No, I just liked very much this idea that you were mentioning of transcribing ideas. You used transcribe, and as you know, it's something we scientists use a lot as well. No? Just transcribing ideas or whatever into drawings, diagrams. Also using metaphors. No. How do you think is the process you are using similar to what scientists are doing?
I think that one of the things I found when I was doing the research for the PhD, and is something that I still find, whilst although the subjects are very different, many of the processes are very, very similar. The idea of compilation, the idea of collage, the idea of translation, the idea of serialization are very similar in artistic processes. And one of the initial reasons that I looked at scientific procedures was specifically because I was more familiar with artistic ones. And I was amazed to see how often these processes could be equivalent to our ways of artistic making. Maybe the difference is in how the interpretations of ultimately what is made is very different. Goodman talks about how science looks for clarity in a chord, whereas maybe in the arts there is a search for almost density, what he calls syntactical density, this idea of multiple interpretations or of doubt that can come from these processes. But I would say there are very similar ways of making. What the intention is very different.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Anyone? Any question? Comment?
I'd also like to say that my hope is that this is part one. I would like to think that in part two, there will be a way that I can present this in a more visual format out with the limitations of Zoom. I normally talk standing up and moving around, so I find sitting at a screen the hardest thing to do because it limits, I think through doing and I talk through moving. So to sit on a chair, I find creates a whole new way of looking at the way one talks about it.
Yeah, of course. Hopefully, when all this passes, and we will love you to come to IRB and give a talk and explain what you've done at IRB with our scientists.
I have a comment.
Yeah, go
Joe.
ahead.
I like that you showed so many protein structures, and from your perspective as an artist, you start from one example and you try to derivate things related to that particular structure that you have found. My question would be if it would make sense on your artist procedure to analyze series of structures and see what they may have in common, or that would be the reverse process of how an artist looks like at these structures.
No, not at all. I've only shown you a few, but I have hundreds of images that I have collected and considered. To me, it's interesting to compare a lot of different examples. I would say that while I don't necessarily want to extract a response to a hypothesis, that very definitely I'm interested in as many different structures as can be seen. And one of the reasons I wanted specifically to be able to access the IRB was to try and have a better understanding of the diffraction process and the construction of proteins. And I was able to see part of that with Blazej. And my hope is to be able to see more of it because I'm fascinated with the idea of how the process is quantitative in the sense it produces data, but it's so poetic. Listening to Hodgkin talk about the process is amazing. And it was like, if you saw science like this, maybe as a small person, I would have followed a different procedure, or I would have followed a different process in life. But I think it's how those processes are incredibly complex, and therefore how the data that's extracted is quantitative, but the process is almost like metaphor in itself.
Nice. I see Blazej is here. Do you want to comment something, Blazej? I don't know if he's there. if you would like, no?
I would like to comment something.
Sure,
Jo.
Neus.
Yeah, it's because I like it, this idea of covered conversation, because it's very original, yes. And in that case, because we had also later experience with other artists, and they talk a lot with the scientists, no? And you can have an objective view of the scientist and subjective view, no, both. But this, if you go through the conversation and you have no interaction, no, with them, which is, if you could explain a little bit this experience also.
Well, one of the things, because it was so hard to actually gain access to the labs with COVID, and I have an official IRB email, and I'm within the communication department. So there are all these different emails that appear, and it was just fascinating to me that suddenly somebody would say, does anybody need this? And there would be a series of letters and initials. And there's a shorthand in relation to how you talk about things. And so I have a kind of semi-dialogue with thinking, what are those things? And obviously I can access by doing, through an internet search, but I'm interested in how those letters or those kind of conversations set up a whole completely different kind of dialogue or a different kind of story or narrative that would reveals a process of collaboration and community that I think is really special, because there is this sense of, in COVID times, people were sharing, and even in the IRB, there's a kind of not wanting to misuse materials, wanting to share materials, or also help, I need help, and people responding. So I was very interested in, I was very much a voyeur, because I couldn't offer anybody, I didn't even know what materials were, but I could follow and trace how people did respond, how things would curiously appear lost, or has anybody found, and different bits of material moving through the department. And so I was interested in that idea of just watching, being, I'm kind of like big brother in a curious kind of email intrusion.
So I like it so much. Yeah.
Nice. I just want to say that this happens also in not COVID times. We also like to share and help
Yeah.
in normal times.
Well, judging from Anthony's laughter when I mentioned it, he'd obviously had the same experience. I think it's a kind of thing that doesn't necessarily appear in other institutions, or in, certainly within the arts. Artists, yes, will ask their friends for help, but there isn't the same structure for the exchange of ideas. And I think that's one of the things that I find most interesting about my experience with working with scientists through scientific congresses that I've been to, such as Brienne's, the willingness to share information, the openness to sharing information. And I think that's something to be treasured.
No, but thank you. The original is transforming this in an artist thing. This is very, for us.
The difficult thing is how to transform this information into something that it's capable to understand for everybody. No, that's because I don't know with you that Joe and Anthony, that it was very technician. The language at the beginning, it was very technical, and you maybe Joe are more used to it, but I find it difficult, and also as an artist, it was my challenge, not to transform this as a view of life, but understandable for everybody, and how to connect all these images to a real thought. So I don't know.
No, I agree. When I was having some of the conversations, I would ask Joel and Cara and Marta, and particularly Blase, who talks very, very fast, if I could record the conversations, basically because so much information came through. And it was shorthand, but I was kind of like, well, hang on a minute, I'm kind of traveling in space-time with knowledge that is so far over my head. And so I can, even when I re-listen to the conversations, it's still, I've listened to some of them 3 or 4 times just to see if I can try and gain a handle on some of the structures. So I think it's becoming aware, and I suppose within art the same happens so often. if you go to contemporary art presentations, it can sound as dense as some of the scientific presentations that I've seen. So it's about trying to find, I'm interested in trying to find something that feels familiar but strange in a way that can create dialogue. So in your images, I've seen how there's an amazing kind of play between the data and also the kind of familiar images of, say, Hieronymus Bosch, but retranslated. And so it's trying to find a way and for me about how I can find something that's more humdrum, that's almost tactile, or that's almost with the covert conversations, I suspect it would be almost playful through sound to try and create that sense of a way in, because I don't want to feel as if it's about representing something so much as finding a way in so that people can think about it, or at least be intrigued enough to carry on investigating.
Nice. Anthony, do you want to comment something?
Yeah, I was going to quote Ernest and say it's just basic science. But you knew that was coming.
You need to explain this to the audience.
So this is something that Ernest said to me a lot last year when he was obviously seeing my eyes roll back in my head, thinking I have no idea what he's talking about. But I think I kind of have a vague idea of the intent of the communication. And yeah, so it became a bit of a refrain between me and Muriel when she'd say, "How was your day today?" And I go, "Oh, it's just basic science." But Joe, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed what you were bringing up and some of the, I guess the challenges you throw down too. And I just was curious. One of the things a couple of things you talked about was ideas of layering, of translation, and obviously of metaphor. And when you were talking about metaphor, I was wondering if you were familiar with the writing of Lakoff and Johnson's writing around metaphor, which is a really interesting book on that, just this whole way of how we understand the world through metaphor, really. But I also was curious, I suppose, for me, and it's interesting to see Anna sitting there with her huge and paintings behind her, this idea of scale. And for me, this is something that is I've kind of carried with me back to this end of the world and have been working on. That my experience was to feel both incredibly huge and incredibly small all at the same time. And you kind of did these drawings for SolidWorks, which are like a kind of Mobius strip. And I sort of felt constantly turned, or still feel sort of turned inside out. And I'm curious about how you are thinking about scale in your approach to your creative practice.
With the models, I was particularly actually trying to create pieces that would be conversation pieces that could be passed from hand to hand. Because one of the things I find within studio visits is that people pick things up, and it's almost like having something in their hand allows them to articulate a series of questions or think about things in a way that feels more closer or feels more intimate. And so with the small works, the reason I was particularly interested in doing them with 3D printing is that they could be reproduced ad infinitum if they got broken, so that people could handle them in a way that wasn't precious. And so they were particularly designed to be hand-sized. But I also wanted to find ways of making pieces that people didn't feel as if they had to have a physical inaction, that they could have a more visual interaction. And so that's why the larger pieces are very much about a kind of invasive scale. So it's almost like trying to be bigger than the human. They're certainly bigger than me, but that's another point. So it's playing with this idea of the contrast between the two. And the actual drawings that I've been doing that are very much like tabletop, they're kind of A3 size. So that's more to come through on a kind of COVID problem, but also as a way of just working through ideas. Ultimately, I suspect the the pieces I hope to present in Montserrat in the museum will be a large-scale installation, but quite possibly using sculptural methods rather than painting. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think the way of understanding something through the sort of haptic, touching, kinesthetic means, I think, is yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, you know, that this is, in fact, coming back to Ernest, this is how he was explaining things to me a lot. And I think a lot of you will have sat in his office with his models of peptides, and as he tries to explain stuff that you still don't understand. But it's seeing and manipulating is such a I suppose a fundamental way of us understanding the world. And for me, you know, look at what Nuis does, looking at the histopathology, and I see that's just it's the scientific methodology of manipulating and moving things around, rather than to create something that then enables the science to sort of unfold, I suppose. And then maybe for us, it's the practice, it's the process that is maybe the unraveling and the raveling all at the same time.
Well, it's interesting, and there's a whole series of mathematical sculptures developed by Lagrange they're beautiful kind of sculptures in brass and string, and you can move them around, and there's kind of parallel versions in plaster. And I was like, wow, if somebody talked to me about maths with those in front of me, you would have had a very different interpretation, because you could suddenly see how formulas made physical spaces. Whereas it's very different if you just see a formula. I mean, I liked maths, but still, if I'd seen it in that kind of structure, I'm sure it would have been a very different experience. And so I think how being able to manipulate something and being able to kind of think through a kind of time sequence rather than it just being one image allows a different way in. And to me, it was like one of my dream hobbies would be to be able to make an exhibition solely of some of the sculptures that I discovered in looking through protein structure models, because some of them are just the most fascinating sculptures I've ever seen. They were obviously designed to be clear and specified, but they're kind of fascinating in how somebody's tried to adapt X-ray diffraction into, be it Tygon tubing or to brass or to balsa wood. Some of them are very, very kind of humdrum in their applications, but incredibly powerful as objects to consider.
Yeah, I think one of the things, the plasticine model that you showed, one of the things I really loved about it was it was kind of grotesque, but it also had thumb marks, and you know, you could that I found really fascinating, that somebody was exploring this idea of kind of pure science, but it still had, you know, like the maker's mark, if you like, which is I suppose such a big thing in creative practice, but is something like, you know, the sort of big no-no of talking of, you know, using a personal pronoun in science or maths.
Totally. I mean, interesting, they talk about it being really ugly when it was made, and how it was such beautiful science, but such an ugly thing. And he did make another one in plaster. But to me, it had a kind of, there's a viscerality about it that is so peculiar and so unexpected. And it's like trying to find a way through, I suppose in my art making practice, I'm curious, I don't have much kind of, there's not many fingerprints. I mean, it's not that kind of material, but it's trying to find a way to make something suitably strange that you question what it is you're looking at. And therefore, be it through the title or be it through the explanation of the exhibition, trying to find a way to set up a dialogue between the thoughts and the speculations that have led me to explore those ideas.
Yeah, so it's kind of like materializing the thinking, which I think is a really lovely way of, for me, and I think I'm going to take that image. I haven't seen that before, and that's going to bury its way into my brain, which is, thank you for that.
Yeah, and also I think it's very important because if for normal people, if you don't see the invisible world, it doesn't exist. So you cannot have the perception and of what it means, and it cannot change your life. And once you see it, it's inside of your perception, and your whole mind shifts and have new ideas. So that's a very important issue of our work. Let's say it's to bring in the surface these invisible worlds. Otherwise, it's not in the perception of anybody, of not anybody, well, of many people.
No, totally. I mean, in that sense, I think just talking to Blazej and Marta and Joel, and just seeing how they kind of analyze the different structures of cellular organisms, you're just kind of like, wow, that's a whole, it's like going down a rabbit hole. There's a whole other kind of cosmos within the whole kind of structure, and how you can bring those into view or into touch.
Nice. I like these conversations between you guys. Any scientists that want to jump in the conversation? I just want to mention this idea of the protein structure, right? But how it is related to function. So I like very much this idea, well, and this concept, right? It's not only the structure, like a pretty structure, right? But the function it carries, right? So a small change in this structure and the function is altered. So I don't know how this could be, I don't know, put into the art pieces, but this concept is very important for scientists, I think, right? So this concept of a mutation that changes an amino acid, then changes the structure, and then the protein is not functioning or whatever. Just leave it here.
No, one of the ideas that I've been thinking about, but it's taking a long time to filter through, in the sense that talking to Marta and Joel, there were various issues that came up, but it's like trying to understand it sufficiently that you can reinterpret it or find a way to create a parallel metaphor that functions. It can involve manipulation, or that can be through games.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Someone else? Any other remark? Otherwise, we'll leave it here. No? Okay, so thank you very much for coming, everyone, to Joe especially for this nice talk, and for this nice discussion with everyone, guys. So thank you, and see you in the next Art and Science event.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.